Chapter 9. Lark pointed to the slate on the wall. Chores. Do a good job today. There won't be time for it tomorrow. Daja, after you scrub the privy, ask Rosethorn for herbs to sweeten the air. Briar, don't neglect corners when you dust and sweep. Everyone got to work. Even the dedicates swept out their workrooms and cleaned the altar tucked in the corner between Sandry's room and the front door. Once they were finished, they vanished into their workrooms. Pouring hot water into the tub where dishes awaited Sandry, Triss saw that Briar scratched at the floor with a broom. No, no, she called. Dust first, then sweep. That way you get the dust you knock to the floor. He looked at the broom and at the dust cloth. You do? Triss went to Briar. Here. She ran the cloth over a table, carefully doing the corners. Aunt Uriel, who had kept her for 3 years, always checked her dusting, making her do it all over if she missed a spot. Do flat surfaces this way. When the rag gets dirty, shake it out the window. Now you, there's a shelf. The shelf that she pointed to held a few small objects. Briar nervously poked at the spaces between them with his cloth. No, cried Triss. You have to pick them up and dust them and do the shelf under them. Honestly, you'd think you never dusted in your life. I haven't. Who'd guess that people did things to keep their homes clean, or that they'd want clean homes in the first place, he thought. Me neither, called Sandry from the wash tub. Trish pushed her spectacles up on her nose. But we had servants, explained the other girl. Briar shrugged. I didn't have a house. Maybe my dam had a room, but she died years ago. The thief lord wasn't what you'd call a bear for housekeeping. Ugh, Mila bless us, Triss said. Well then, watch me. Carefully she lifted the vase that Briar had tried to work around and dusted it. See? And before you put it back, she briskly ran the cloth over the spot where the vase had been, then returned it to its former position. Handing the cloth to the boy, she pointed to the dog statuette that was next on the shelf. Now you. Once he was dusting well enough to suit her, she went to the dishes that Sandry had washed and began to rinse and dry them. Shaking her head, she muttered to the other girl, No house, as well as live among savages. We had fine tunnels underground, Briar remarked. His back was to them as he dusted, so he couldn't see Triss's glare. If you didn't mind rats. My mate Slug, he trained a rat to bite the toes of merchant folk. You should have seen them jump. Smart rat, eh? I don't think it's funny, Triss told Sandry, who giggled helplessly. After that, Triss kept her opinions about Briar's upbringing to herself. The boy grinned and set about dusting the window ledges. That morning, Nico held their class in meditation at Discipline. Before they started, Lark and Rosethorn did an odd thing. They walked a circle around the cottage. Lark going clockwise, Rosethorn counterclockwise. Lark carried a ball of white yarn, letting it unroll until the yarn reached all the way around the house. At the front door, where she'd started, she tied the ends together so that it made a closed circle. Rosethorn carried a basket of dried herbs with her and trickled a stream of them in her wake as she walked her own circle. When she finished, the dried leaves and stems formed another O that enclosed the cottage. Only then did she and Lark join everyone else in the main room. Why did you do that? Sandry wanted to know. It's to keep magic from leaking in as we meditate, replied Nico. Rosethorn muttered, or from leaking out. Everyone, Nico said, frowning at her, breathe and count. 1, 2, 3. The dedicates sat on the floor and performed the breathing exercise with the rest of them. Today it seemed easier for the children to bring their minds to a pinpoint of concentration. Nico looked genuinely pleased when they finished and told them they had made real progress. Going outside, Lark untied her yarn and rolled it up. Rosethorn followed. Scuffing her foot through the line of herbs in several places, she broke her circle. During midday, Lark gave Daja a scarlet armband and a scarlet headband to show that she was a traitor in mourning. Watching Daja put them on, Sandry looked at her black clothes. Her own mourning was not suited to housework or to carding and spinning wool. Even after she'd used Lark's wool-drawing charm, her overdress last night still had a fuzzy white coat. She finished washing the midday dishes, then climbed the stairs. Her boxes were neatly stacked in an attic corner. Opening them, she found her old everyday summer gowns. A rose muslin and 2 blue ones, 2 brown linen dresses, and undergowns in white or undyed cotton and linen. These were the things she had worn last year, plain clothes for traveling in. For a moment she hugged them. breathing in the sweet pea sachet that Parisi had always tucked into her boxes. Wiping a hand over her watering eyes. So much dust up here, she muttered. She stripped off her black cambric overgown. The rose muslin scent went on in its place, and she sighed with relief. Light as the cambric had been, this was much more comfortable. Once she was finished with her things, she looked around. The doors to Triss's and Daja's room were open. Where had they gone? She didn't think they'd left the cottage. Turning, she saw a ladder that led through an open trapdoor in the roof. She climbed it and found the other two girls seated on the thatch. "It's still wet from the storm, isn't it?" she inquired. Triss patted the canvas that she had brought to sit on. "Though if it keeps this hot, it'll dry by tomorrow." Lying back, she linked her hands behind her neck. Daja stood by the chimney, one arm around it as if it were a mast. Shading her eyes, she inspected Winding Circle. "Actually, this is a nice view," she remarked. "This whole place is built like a bowl. It's almost the same as the Amphitheater of Heroes in Zaktan Hatar." Sandry made a face. Triss moved over, offering her a place on the canvas. The noble took it. "Only there's no buildings or trees there," Daja went on. Quietly, Sandra told her, "There isn't an amphitheater anymore either. After the smallpox epidemic, they took all the bodies into it, then burned the whole thing. It was only made of wood." Hurriedly, Triss drew a god circle on her chest. "That's horrible," she remarked with a shudder. Sandry tied a straw out of thatch. "When Nico and I left, the king was saying he'd rebuild it in marble." "It should look nice," Daja said with approval. "White or black marble, did he say?" Sandry's gloom lifted. "I forgot to ask," she replied with a tiny smile. "I still wasn't talking very much then." "Speaking of you talking," Daja came to share the canvas with them. "That novice won't forget you pulled rank on him in front of Crane and everyone, just like the girls from your old dormitory won't forget." Triss opened a sleepy gray eye. "She did odd things in her old dormitory, too." "She took up for me," explained the traitor. "Remind me to write them a note saying that I apologize," Sandra replied, tossing her braids back over her shoulders. Daja shook her head. "Why get in the middle? Briar stole that tree, and it was costly. Minimum I ever saw a chican price for was 10 silver astrals." Triss clicked her tongue against her teeth, impressed. "I had to help," Sandra replied flatly. "He's one of us." Daja blinked. "Is there an us?" Sandry looked surprised. "Certainly. Didn't that thing this morning convince you?" "I try not to let fights convince me of anything." Daja lay back. "And I wasn't in it. Not really," objected Triss. "Oh, stop." Sandry gave her a friendly push. "Why did you go to help if you didn't care if they got him?" Triss blushed scarlet and held her tongue, not wanting to say that she half hoped to see him in real trouble. Should she tell the others that he was at the foot of the ladder now, listening? The warm air that rose through the trap door from the house below carried the sound of his breathing to her sensitive ears. "You're getting ahead of yourself," Daja said, yawning. "I don't want to be an us with a bunch of cocks." "Or I with a traitor and a noble and a thief," remarked Triss sleepily. "You'll see," retorted Sandry. "I know what I'm talking about." From atop the hub, the bell tolled the end of the rest period. Triss heard Briar tiptoe out of the attic as the girls got to their feet. Folding her canvas, she thought, "At least he'll have the decency to pretend he didn't hear any of that." "What are you and Nico doing today?" asked Sandry, descending the ladder. "Pass the cloth to me." Triss obeyed. "We're going down to the cove," she explained, climbing into the attic once Sandry had gotten off the ladder. "He mentioned something about learning tides, and I get to practice my meditation some more." "Good luck," Sandry replied. "Thanks," Triss said, her voice very dry. "I'll probably need it." Fretting, Briar watched as Rosethorn lifted his tree from the counter in her workroom. She cupped its small round pot in her hands, dirt-stained fingers probing the openings in the bottom and testing each bump in the glaze. "Why are there holes?" he asked, unable to keep still. "Won't the dirt fall out?" "They let the water drain through as it does in the ground. You put screens over the holes to keep dirt in. Now hush." Closing her eyes, Rosethorn ran her fingers over the earth in the pot, then over the surface twists that were part of the chican's roots. Briar's nose itched. The scent in that room of black earth, herbs, and flowers of rain on hot stones filled his ears and nose, tickling his eyes, pressing on his skin. Opening his mouth, he breathed deep to taste it. Something within him replied to its call. adding moss, briars, and young, twining plants to the feelings in the air. Fingers tweaked his nose. Ow! He rubbed the abused spot. Don't do that, Rosethorn said, not unkindly. You've gotten them all excited. Gotten who? He looked to see if his chican was all right. To his surprise, there were fresh green buds on some twigs. Glancing around, he saw new leaves on the plants by the windows. You know better, Rosethorn told the miniature tree. You know very well you can't keep most of those. You talk like it understands, Briar complained. Rosethorn's eyes laughed at him. It does understand. After 146 years, it knows more about how it must grow and not grow than we do. Taking his hand, she put it on the chican's trunk. A tickling like fire shot through him, making him wish he could roll in gravel and scratch like a dog. He yelped and pulled away. The tickling faded. You felt unrestrained growth, the dark side of the green man, Rosethorn said. If you let that go, the whole plant is weakened. It's in such a hurry to throw out new twigs that it doesn't take the time to build them strong. We have to cut off most of the new growth and clip a few branches and roots. What's left will be hardier and longer lived. He grabbed the pot and hugged it to his chest. You're going to cut it? The tree protested. He was bending its twigs. Briar held it away from him. Cutting shapes, chican. It scratches the itches. Put it on the counter. He did as she ordered, warily. More than anything else, it needs a new pot. Even Crane should have seen this one is no good. That, at last, made sense. A bigger one, right? Asked Briar, scratching his itching knuckles. That one's too small for a tree. No, a flatter and broader one. Gently, he touched one of the branches he'd bent, stroking the wood. But it won't have room to grow. It's not supposed to grow. Not like you mean. It's how you fit a mature tree of a century or more into a pot in the first place. She thought for a moment, crossing her foot, tapping. Briar put his left palm on the tree's trunk and closed his eyes. He could feel something inside the living wood, like soft fire. He prodded it toward the cold spots that were the chican's withered branches, where its fire was somehow blocked. The fire tried to obey, but the dead areas were too strong. I need you to go to the potter's, Rosethorn said, and you're sweating. Are you all right? Dazed, Briar let go of the chican and wiped his forehead on his arm. I'm fine, I was just thinking. She looked unconvinced. Pointing to a stack of slates and a box of white lumps beside them, she ordered 2 slates and a piece of chalk. Briar got them. Using the chalk, Rosethorn sketched a long rectangle with holes at each end, then a short rectangle, both on one slate. He guessed that these were the dish that she needed, though he couldn't read the writing she put next to each drawing. As she wrote on the other slate, he rested his fingers on the chican's trunk again. Before, he'd itched with raw new growth. Next, he'd felt its pulse. This time, he found patience. The slow and steady wait over years in sun and cloud. Eyes closed, he breathed deep of the heavy, green smell that filled the workroom once again. His nerves steadied. You need to keep your chican outdoors, but close to you. A shelf on your front window will do nicely. Rosethorn gave him the slates. This one for delicate watergrass at the potter's, this for delicate lancewood at the carpenter's. Wait for their reply, then come back. I'm not trimming the chican. You are. Briar gulped and fled. All afternoon, Sandry labored to spin thread. Carefully, she nursed her spindle, usually remembering to twirl it again before it spun in the wrong direction and undid all her work. Her attention, as much as she could spare from the spindle, was locked on her fingers as she tried to feed only small amounts of wool to the thread. There was just one more thing she wanted to do, if only to see whether she had dreamed her last days in the cellar or not. Taking a deep breath, she tried to think only of calling light into her thread. The turning of the spindle, like a flat top at the end of a string, drew her eye, making her drowsy. She imagined bits pulling free of the sun's rays, coming to tangle in the wool, twisting to form a thread that was both fiber and light. Here was a glowing patch. Another bit of light winked from the work just coming from her fingers. It was time to stop and wind nearly 2 feet of gleaming thread onto the shaft. When triumph at her success flooded her mind, the light in her thread flared, blinding her. The wool in her rowlag, uneven in the middle, parted. The thread dropped through her fingers. Down fell the spindle, whirling counterclockwise and doing all her work. Every bit of light in it went dark. Lark, who was putting a new web of thread on her floor loom, saw the girl cover her face with her hands. "You need a rest," she told Sandry. "Go outside. Look at the colors you see, and the flowers, and the people. It will go better if you relax." "I feel so stupid." Sandry collected what had once been nearly 2 feet of light thread. Now it was pieces of carded wool that unspun themselves where they lay. "I know children spin well. Why can't I?" "Perhaps children practice for longer than a week before they expect to have a proper thread," suggested Lark. "And they don't try to work magic at the same time." "But I did the magic once before," cried the girl, "when you had nothing else to think about. The hammering we heard earlier didn't help my concentration either. You've been at this too long anyway. It's important to rest." Lark smiled. "Go out, Sandry. The wool can't run away." The girl obeyed, walking onto the slab of rock that served the cottage as a doorstep. Her ears rang. Her muscles felt weak and unused. Glumly, she looked for the source of all the hammering so close to Lark's workroom. She didn't have to look far. There was a shelf of bright new wood on Briar's windowsill. Briar himself walked around the corner of the house, his stolen tree in his hands. Carefully, lovingly, he placed it on the shelf. Somehow the chican seemed different from the plant he'd stolen earlier. Curious, Sandry got to her feet. Briar flinched. He hadn't seen her there, and turned his face away when she came over to look at his prize. "Hello," Sandry told him. The chican sported a new pot, a wide, shallow tray with a cool green finish. There were fresh cuts where branches had been clipped off and painted over with a tan liquid. The twigs all looked too short, and it took a minute for her to see why. The buds had been removed. "What did you do to it?" When he turned, she saw tear tracks on his golden brown cheeks. "Why were you crying?" Digging in her pocket, she produced one of her black-bordered handkerchiefs. "I'm not crying," he growled and swiped the back of his hand under one eye. Startled, he realized wetness was there. "Pruning hurts us," he muttered. "Take it." Sandry thrust the handkerchief under his nose, thinking, "At least it doesn't pain me when the thread goes to pieces." Was it a bad hurt, like when someone kicks you, or a good one, like when a healer sets a broken bone? He shifted the tree slightly, wanting it to receive a perfect mix of sun and shade. "Never had a healer." He scoured his cheeks with the fine white cloth. "I guess it was a good hurt, like when I lost my baby teeth." He offered the handkerchief back to her and saw the stains and dirt his fingers had left. "It's a mess. I'm sorry." "Keep it," Sandry replied. "The Hatteran lady who bought my mourning clothes got so many handkerchiefs I think she expected me to cry for years." "Can I touch the tree?" He glanced at her, then at his chican. "Don't hurt it, or scare it." Gently, she ran a finger along the trunk. 2 of the larger branches were loosely wrapped in metal spirals. "What's this wire for?" "It helps the tree grow in the shape you want," Rosethorn said. He scuffed a bare foot. He'd misplaced his uncomfortable new shoes somewhere on the ground. "Listen, thank you for earlier." The words were hard to say. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did. Maybe you'll do something for me one day." "Don't hold your breath," he advised, sounding more like his normal self. She grinned at him. "Don't worry, I won't." "Last piece of the day," Frostpine grunted, hammering a hot bar of iron. "Kirill, I need that stripped now." Daja watched as the apprentice put on heavy leather gloves, picked up the tongs, and drew the iron from the fire. She could see that his grip on the cherry red metal was awkward as he turned from the forge, and nearly said so. Instead, she bit her tongue. Most people Kirill's age would not like advice from an 11-year-old girl. The novice caught his foot and stumbled. His tongs dropped from his grip. She didn't think. She grabbed the hot iron before it struck the ground. Lifting it with a relieved sigh, she offered it to Kirill. The novice backed away, eyes wide in horror. The forge stopped his retreat. "Kirill, Daja?" asked Frostpine. "What's wrong?" Daja still held the red metal out to the novice, though she had begun to shake, just so her own kin would look at her for handling the work of Luksha, for spending a whole afternoon in a Luksha shop. Gently, Frostpine reached over her shoulder and took the hot bar from her grip. Kirill ran outside. Frostpine placed the iron on the rim of the forge. "Show me your hands." Daja obeyed. He turned them palm up in his own. They were unmarked. "Will you get the iron from my anvil?" he asked, folding her fingers over her palms and giving them a squeeze. Put it beside this piece. Don't stick them back in the fire. Get 2 fresh iron bars from that box and put them in till a third of the bars on the coals. Frostpine, she whispered, not sure of what she wanted to say. You'll be all right, the smith told her. These big northern lads are just a bit high-strung. He went outside. Daja put the iron on the fire, then stood in the doorway to cool herself off. She heard Frostpine whispering, say, I warned you when you came to me that you could see odd things. A girl who holds red-hot metal in her hands? That's more than just odd. I don't understand why you're upset. I do the same thing all the time. You're a great mage, perhaps the greatest smith mage in the world. I always assumed you'd learned it after years of study. Daja stepped away, not wanting to eavesdrop anymore. Once out of hearing, she regarded her hands, dark brown with tan and brown palms. They were stripped with heavy calluses from the hard labor that went with being part of third ship Kasubo. Going to the forge, she hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the red tip of the iron bar she had caught. Felt warm, but pleasantly so. Now, Frostpine said, coming back inside. She looked at his hands. He'd taken the hot iron from her. He wore no gloves. Now that she thought of it, he hadn't worn them all afternoon. Where were we? Supper was a quiet meal. Only Nico, Lark, and Rosethorn talked. The 4 children were exhausted after their day, half asleep before sunset. We'll visit the baths now. Lark and I will clean up after we return, Rosethorn said when they had finished. You children go to bed early. You look done up. Why the change? Asked Sandry, yawning. Once a month, we go to Summersea Market, explained Lark. We sell goods from Winding Circle's booth. Sandry clapped her hands. Triss sat up straight and Daja smiled. Summersea was one of the Pebbled Sea's great ports. The market would have all sorts of interesting things. It's too soon for me to leave my chican, protested Briar. I should stay with it. What if that delicate crane steals it back? He wouldn't dare, Rosethorn replied. And it's no good hovering over a chican. They take their time. Lark stood. Everyone collect your bathing gear. From the look of things, we'll have to make sure you don't fall asleep and drown. The children raced to obey.